And welcome back to Morning Show. So, ladies and gentlemen, if you recall, a couple of days ago, I said in a video that the ANC was polling at 32%. And there were a number of individuals that came on to basically fact check me and say, yeah, but Franz Cronje was on a Biz News, whatever. And he said the ANC was at 45% and something, something, something. And so the allegation that the ANC is down at 32% must have been false. Well, for those of you who don't know, Franz Cronje has a research foundation called the Social Research Foundation. And Gabriel joins me today from the Social Research Foundation to tell me about the data and how it shows that the ANC is at 32%. Hello, Gabriel. Welcome to the show.
Byron, thank you so much for having me on. And as you said, I think it's worth reiterating this that our data from our current poll, the newest poll that we did, shows that the ANC is at 32%. When it comes to the rest of the parties, the DA sits at around 25%, MK at 12%, EFF at 6%, IFP's at 3%, and then the rest of the parties are well within our margin of error, and so we can't really say anything substantive about them. But if any of your incredibly enlightened viewers are doing any matchbox calculations, they might realize that the numbers I've given you don't add up to 100%. And that's the most important finding from this new survey that we've done, in which 15% of the voter base are undecided. And they are undecided, truly undecided. That doesn't mean they just answered, I don't know, to the question, who are you going to vote for in the next election? Because we don't just use that question as the basis for our modeling. We use a number of different questions, including leadership favorability, party favorability, and some performance indicators. And so when we get 15% of the vote that say they are undecided, what it means is that they failed to reach any of the numerical thresholds to be assigned to a particular party. So they are truly undecided in that they have no warm feelings to any of the parties in South Africa. And so we really do have the situation in which a significant chunk of the voter base who are going to vote in the next election are sitting, watching, and waiting.
Yeah, no, you see, I read your statistics and your data, and there's a few things in that that are rather interesting. Okay, so let's go through them. The first is that this idea that the voter block, 15% of the voter block is undecided, is it appears to be intrinsically linked with the success of the GNU. So I think that the success of the GNU and what that actually means ultimately in terms of reforms for the country and the output will determine on whether or not they decide to vote predominantly DA or ANC or MK or whatever else. And it does seem to suggest that a failing GNU may go not actually in the ANC's favor. Have I read that correctly?
You have, but I think what is important to note is that the kind of displacement of these 15% of voters who are, one should think of them as ANC voters because the only party that lost out in this latest poll is the ANC. And so
Mm.
these, maybe it's 11%, maybe it's 15%, whatever percent of the voters, they're ANC voters. And so one has to ask the question, well, what is it? Because we polled the GNU already in September, and in September the ANC was at 45%. So what is it
Mhm.
since September to now that has changed that everyone else remains at the same, but the ANC is the one being punished? And well, if you think about it, the answer is quite obvious in that in 100 days, it looked like the GNU might be focused on the correct reforms to bring about the improvement of material circumstances in people's lives, which they have been craving and which they believe the GNU would provide.
Mhm.
Now we see that the GNU has actually a policy agenda which basically resembles the previous parliament with an ANC majority. The ANC dominates the parliamentary agenda. But what is interesting, for at least from a social research foundation perspective, is that we know that the average South African voter does not like the ANC's populist policy agenda. We saw it with NHI during the run up to the election, where immediately after it was signed, the ANC had been polling up and began polling downwards. And now we see it in our numbers on expropriation, where we get about two-thirds of all voters and 60% of ANC voters who are opposed to expropriation across three different metrics. They don't trust the government to expropriate. They don't think it's a good economic idea, but they do think it will drive away foreign investment. And so the fact is that voters now have seen that the GNU appears to resemble an ANC policy agenda. And voters are frustrated by the ANC and they're frustrated by that policy agenda. And so there's no reason from any of the other parties to switch to them because they haven't really done much in the intervening period. But there is a reason to switch out of the ANC, which is they're following the path that led them to the worst electoral result that they've ever had, and given no indication that they're changing course.
Yeah, so a key example of that was obviously NHI. So obviously Cyril rushed in the last moment to sign NHI into power. And according to some statistics, that actual signing of the NHI ended up costing him 5% of the electoral vote, which is ironic because they could have actually probably cobbled together a better majority without actually needing the DA had they actually not signed NHI in. But since it's been signed in, they've obviously had numerous powwows with Byron, the health moron, who seems to not really want to engage with anybody. He is fixated on making NHR a thing. He seems to somehow think that it's going to enshrine his name in history. He's going to be the new Margaret Thatcher of South Africa because look at this wonderful thing that he bankrupted the state with called NHI. And it's very interesting that so far he's already spent nearly 28 million rand, a complete waste of taxpayer money, to brand the NHI on buses and various other places in order to try to sell the idea to the general public. Now, that idea that he's selling to the public isn't lost on the public because what the public eventually see is they see the same issues that they were like, oh, this again. Like, I thought we were done with this when we voted the ANC out. The same thing's now happening with expropriation without compensation in terms of the spotlight shining onto the government from the US. Other people now are saying, why is the US on about this? I thought we changed the government. And they're like, actually, they signed this in and it's now a possibility. And people are like, oh, yeah, this stuff. Now, to the undiscerning listener, the usual response I personally get, even in my own chat sections, is that actually the ANC didn't get rejected for the right wing type parties, the market oriented parties. The general consensus is the ANC got rejected by the more hard left socialist policies. Their numbers went to the EFF and the MK party. And then when you actually added those parties up together, you got like 60% of the electorate. And then they argue that actually what the ANC should be doing is going more hard left. What's your view on that based on the data that you've collected?
So I think on the surface level, that kind of argument makes sense. But what's interesting from my perspective is that we poll people's beliefs and we break down the polls by all number of different demographics. But one of the things that I have great data on is what are the fundamental beliefs in the political parties. And I think that there is a genuine misunderstanding in South Africa when it comes to why people vote for the EFF and why people vote for the MK party. Because when we poll the values of the people who make up the voter base, you will find that if I were to give you a blind sample, I would say, and give you, for example, the opinions on BEE of DA voters and MK voters, you would not be able to tell me without me telling you which is which, because they essentially believe the same thing. The reason why people voted for MK and the reason why people voted for the EFF was it was a sense of belonging that came to them because they feel rejected by the ANC. So Jacob Zuma perfectly embodied this in his campaign. He was the fallen son of the ANC. He's not a perfect person, but he's being persecuted and cast out by the ANC, who's aloof, and he used that sentiment to draw people towards him. But the people who were voting for him don't read his manifesto and go, oh, yes, this is what I believe in. These policies are going to save South Africa. They
Mm.
think, I just want my life to be better. The ANC has not provided me with the means to improve my life. This guy, I am familiar with him. I kind of like him on a personal level, and I feel his story reflects mine, so I'm going to vote for him. But that has nothing to do with the policies that uh, he prefers. And when you and again, it needs to be reiterated that the MK voters and the EFF voters are as moderate, pragmatic, and conservative as the DA voters. And on some metrics, they are actually more moderate and more pragmatic. I think if you were to do a ranking, you would find that MK voters are the most conservative party voters in the country. It has everything to do with Jacob Zuma's personality. It has nothing to do with Jacob Zuma's policies.
Mm. Now you see the reason that actually becomes interesting to a degree is that actually if you look at it, many individuals gravitated towards the MK because well it was Jacob. They just gravitated towards the MK party because Jacob was a rock star, and they thought Jacob Zuma era of Jacob Zuma wasn't that bad. I mean, we didn't have the load shedding of Ramaphosa, and we still had some jobs. Okay, you can argue that that's actually when the decay started, but when certain people look back, there's a degree of nostalgia. It's always easy to have nostalgia when looking back. But Jacob Zuma's like in his mid 80s, but like he's not long for the world, and that's not being horrible. It's just that's the joys of life. We all get old, and it's going to happen to all of us. So at the end of the day, I made a prediction as well that the EFF wouldn't actually grow because let's call it the type of radicalism that the EFF party embodies doesn't actually gel with a lot of people. A lot of people went to the EFF because it was effectively a protest vote against the ANC. That's actually to a degree why people even voted with the MK as a protest against the ANC. Now, the question you really got to ask yourself is if I know this and you know this and we've got the data to support it, is the ANC going to change anything about it, or are they just going to double down and keep doing what they already do?
Well, one can only hope that the ANC does learn its lesson from this. I imagine that it was quite a nasty shock, especially given that all people, members of the commentariat, seem to have the idea that the ANC was benefiting incredibly from the power games they were playing within the government. But what it turns
Mm,
out is that voters don't like power games. Voters don't like seeing political parties try and maneuver against each other to outwit each other and outsmart each other. And
mm,
it's bared out in the fact that, despite the ANC really being able to dictate the policy direction of the GNU and forcing the DA and so other opposition parties into awkward positions on policies that they don't really align with, the voters haven't responded to that positively. In fact, the ANC has been the only party to really suffer because of that. And so, if the ANC follows and listens to the voters or not, it doesn't really matter because if they don't listen to the voters, they're going to destroy their vote share. And then they will not be able to make decisions any longer, and maybe we'll get a different path in the future. But if they do, and so the only way really that they can win back vote share is by listening to the voters, walking back on the more populist policies, and focusing in on the only thing that has ever provided the ANC with growth as a political party, which is achieving sustained rates of economic growth that allow average South Africans the chance to improve their circumstances, and then maybe the ANC might be able to recover its vote share. But they
not
first
going to
have to
happen.
realize.
Not going to happen. But so I said the reason I say it's not going to happen is what are they going to have to do? Okay, so they're going to have to probably repeal how much B legislation. Not going to happen. then they're going to have to repeal the Expropriation Without Compensation Act. Now, they don't actually have to appeal it. They could just do an amendment to it, which would just clarify key components, and that would probably bring some stability. Do they actually want to do that? No, because it suits them to have this very loose type of expropriation act, because then when they're challenged by people like the EFF or the MK party, they can say, well, look, we did expropriation, we have this bill. They can be like, what's it actually mean? But we did it. Then they would also have to roll back some of the NHR stuff. Okay, arguably we haven't actually implemented a lot of it, so you could really get rid of the contentious clause, which would be the idea of banning medical aids. I think that's the big one, although a lot of people don't know how it's going to get funded. You would have to roll back some austerity measures in terms of national cabinets. You'd have to get rid of the big, even though they're moving now towards big. Why is big a problem? It's not because you have the grant, but because of sustainability and the tax base to pay for it. We just don't have it. And then you've got more difficult problems like infrastructure. You got the power grids. Not being funny, but since the end of apartheid, we built 2 power stations. Neither of them actually work, so we'd have to build new ones. Well, if the last 2 we built don't work, are the next 2 going to work? Don't know. You got Transnet issues there going on. So the reality is that the actual reforms that would be required, in my opinion, are non-existent. The ANC isn't going to change them. Now, if I asked Anthea Jeffries, she'd say, yeah, but this is all part of the National Democratic Revolution, and this is all part of the plan. And you could argue that if you wanted to, but I don't actually think that's what it is. I actually think that we live in a country where we don't really have a leader who is pushing forward any real policies. We know Ramaphosa resigned. He's only really there at the moment for the G20. There's a lot of rumors that once G20 is over, he's going to step aside and go his own way and, go sit on his yacht with babes in Ibiza, which if I was a multi-billionaire, I'd probably do that. I'm sure you would too. Who wants to run South Africa when you can just like have bikini models on your yacht in Ibiza? That sounds like a better ride to me. But the reality is that this isn't going to be something that Ramaphosa has to fix. It will be down to his successor. And the reason I give this entire triad and I mention it is because your data actually shows something very interestingly, and that is serious alliances of the electorate don't actually favor Ramaphosa anymore, do they?
No, they don't. And just a quick note on what you're saying is that the tragedy is that if the ANC were to pursue all of those policies you outlined, they'd be pushing against an open door because that's what everyone wants.
Mm-hmm.
But with regards to Ramaphosa, what the most shocking finding maybe is that in our poll is that when we ask the question, would you support a DA-led motion of no confidence against him? The data split almost essentially 50-50, but that's a significant chunk of the country that are against him. Then we asked another question and we phrased it, would you support him resigning for the poor election results? And when you phrase it like that, now 60% are set against him. And the only people who don't want him to resign are the ANC voters. But the thing is that's clear is that his leadership of the ANC is costing them voters. And so they've, as a party, have this terrible conundrum where he's not liked outside of the party anymore, and he's not going to bring new people in. But if you get rid of him, you bleed voters. And I thought the most interesting thing that we did in this poll was we asked a question, which is, if there was a successful motion of no confidence and Cyril was removed as president, who would you vote for? And under those conditions, the ANC drops to 21%. The DA moves up to 28%. MK is at about 15%, EFF's at 9%. And now 20% of the voter base is undecided, which means that the undecideds are the third largest. And so under those conditions, we have no idea what will happen in the country.
And I think that actually worries a number of individuals in terms of market stability and obviously political stability. And that's probably why we've seen, unfortunately, some few jitters around. And I suppose to a degree, certainly from my perspective, since Trump's offer, there's been a renewed interest in potentially seeking opportunities abroad. Thanks, Donald Trump, for that. Now, it's very interesting that you will recall that one of the data's output was that the only reason the ANC managed to secure the votes that they did was because of the popularity of Ramaphosa. During the last elections, they did say if Ramaphosa stepped aside, there wouldn't be anybody who was popular enough to basically secure some of the ANC votes. Well, he probably is going to step aside now. We know this, as we said, after the G20. Even if he hangs on for a bit, he won't be around to contest the next election. Is there anybody in the ANC, though, that they can actually push forward now? I've heard from Rob Hersoff. He seems to think that the next candidate will be a female because that's what the legacy Ramaphosa wants to lead. But the person was suggested was obviously the minister in the presidency, who's currently now being put forward for a potential case of fraud and corruption amounting a few million, even though she's still in place. I don't know where the step aside position went. But is there anybody actually in the ANC that would poll good enough to take over from Ramaphosa and save the party? Because I don't know of anyone.
Listen, we've polled quite a lot of people inside of the ANC, and outside of Cyril Ramaphosa, there is no one who gets even above 20% favorability. I mean,
Mm,
you look at Paul Mashatile, we've been polling him since 2023, and in this latest survey, he got the highest favorability he's ever got, 15.4%.
mm,
There is, in fact, no one else left in the ANC who is widely liked by the public. That is maybe subject to change, but upon President Ramaphosa coming into office, his favorability was above 60%. So even if they are able to do an incredible job and double someone like Paul Mashatile's favorability, he will have been at only half of what President Ramaphosa was at when he entered office. And so there is a serious gap being left in the party there.
Yeah, and I think that's obviously why, in terms of ANC voters, even when you did your statistics, ANC voters are less likely to want to push Ramaphosa out because they understand that once Ramaphosa's gone, the party's pretty much finished. And this is obviously why the EFF were so adamant that Ramaphosa had to be impeached during the last parliamentary cycle, because had you managed to impeach Ramaphosa, well, the ANC was finished then. Now the ANC is even more finished because it's gone forward and done things that the country doesn't really want. So, actually, on a final question, then, is does this mean that a DA led by John Steenhuisen would be popular? Because according to what I can tell, John is not popular either. What's the data show?
So that's a very interesting and difficult question. So John has sat at his favorability is varied, but he sat solidly somewhere between 18 to 20% for the last year and a half,
Mhm,
which is not a lot, but it's better than Paul Mashatile, and it is the kind of best that a DA politician can hope for. Whether or not, but what's interesting about the DA though is that the ANC seems to have a much harder time of delinking its brand from the brand of its leader, whereas the
mm,
DA's brand is much more popular than its leader ever is. And so
mm,
it doesn't really matter to a large degree who the leader of the DA is, because
mhm,
the DA relies on the brand as a whole and not the brand of the person in charge.
mm. Interesting. Well, there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. That's the latest scoop. So, yeah, for all of you doubters, ANC at 32%. Does this mean that we'll finally see the back of them? Yeah, I don't know. Your guess is as good as mine. Still a long time till the elections, but still interesting times to be alive. Wait and see. Thanks very much for joining us, Gabriel. Pleasure talking to you.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Cheers.